Chapter 3. The Wood Between the Worlds. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly. Then for a moment, everything became muddled. The next thing Diggory knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything, or sitting, or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. "I believe I'm in water," said Diggory, "or under water." This frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel it. He was rushing upward, and then his head suddenly came into the air and found himself scrambling ashore, out onto the smooth, grassy ground at the edge of the pool. As he rose to his feet, he noticed he was neither dripping nor panting for breath, as anyone would expect after being underwater. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from side to side, in a wood. The trees grew close together and were leafy so that he could not get a glimpse of the sky. All the light was green light, and it came through the leaves, but there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for the green daylight was bright and warm. It was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just got out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up with their roots. This wood was very much alive. When he tried to describe it to Diggory, afterward, Diggory always said it was such a rich place, as rich as plum cake. The strangest thing was that almost before he looked about him, Diggory had forgotten how he had come there. At any rate, he certainly was not thinking about Polly or Uncle Andrew or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened or excited or curious. If anyone had asked him, "Where did you come from?" he would probably have said, "I've always been here." That's kind of what it felt like, as if one had always been in the place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he said long afterward, it's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing, and that's all. After Diggory had looked at the wood for a long time, he noticed there was a girl lying on her back at the foot of a tree a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite. It was as if she'd just been sleeping and waking, so he looked at her for a long time and said nothing. At last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time, and she also said nothing. Then she spoke in a dreamy, contented sort of voice. "I think I've seen you before," she said. "I rather think so too," said Diggory. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. "At least I don't know. A very long time." "So have I," said Diggory. "No, you haven't," she said. "I've just seen you come up out of the pool." "Yes, I suppose I did," said Diggory with a puzzled air. "I'd forgotten." Then, for quite a long time, neither of them said any more. "Look here," said the girl presently. "I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I had sort of an idea, a sort of a picture in my head of a boy and a girl like us living somewhere quite different and doing all sorts of things. Perhaps it was only a dream." "I had the same dream, I think," said Diggory, "about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling around rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face." "Aren't you getting it mixed up? In my dream, it was the boy who had the dirty face." "I can't remember the boy's face," said Diggory, and then added, "Hello, what's that?" "Why, it's a guinea pig," said the girl. And it was a fat guinea pig, nosing around in the grass. But round the middle of the guinea pig there ran a tape, and tied onto it by the tape was a bright yellow ring. Look, look, said Diggory, the ring! And look, you've got one on your finger, and so have I. The girl now sat up, really interested at last. They stared very hard at one another, trying to remember, and then at exactly the same moment, she shouted out, Mr. Ketterly! And he shouted out, Uncle Andrew! And they knew who they were and began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes of hard talking, they got it straight. Diggory explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. What do we do now? Said Polly. Take the guinea pig and go home? Here's the guinea pig. There's no hurry, said Diggory with a huge yawn. I think there is, said Polly. This place is too quiet. It's so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give in to it, we shall just lie down and drowse forever and ever. It's very nice here, said Diggory. Yes, it is, said Polly, but we've got to get back. She stood up and began to go cautiously toward the guinea pig, but then changed her mind. We might as well leave the guinea pig, she said. It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will only do something horrid to it if we take him home. I bet he would, answered Diggory. Look at the way he treated us. By the way, how do we get home? Go back to the pool, I expect. They came and stood together at the edge looking down at the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of the green leafy branches and made it look very deep. We haven't any bathing things, said Polly. Bathing things, she means our swimsuits. We shan't need them, silly, said Diggory. We're going in with our clothes on. Don't you remember? It didn't wet us on the way up. Can you swim? A bit. Can you? Well, not much. I don't think we shall need to swim, said Diggory. We want to go down, don't we? Neither of them much liked the idea of jumping into that pool, but neither said so to the other. They took their hands and said, 1, 2, 3, go! And jumped. There was a great splash, and of course they closed their eyes, but when they opened them again, they found they were still standing hand in hand in that green wood and hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool was apparently only a couple of inches deep. They splashed back onto the dry land. What on earth's gone wrong? Said Polly in a frightened voice, but not quite so frightened as you might expect, because it's hard to feel really frightened in that wood. The place is too peaceful. Oh, I know, said Diggory. Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left. I've got 2 greens. Here's one for you. They put on the green rings and came back to the pool, but before they tried another jump, Diggory gave a long, oh! What's the matter? Said Polly. I've just had a really wonderful idea, said Diggory. What are all the other pools? What do you mean? Why, if we can go back to our own world by jumping into this pool, mightn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Supposing there was a world at the bottom of every pool. But I thought we were already in your Uncle Andrew's other world or other place or whatever you called it. Didn't you say? Oh, bother, Uncle Andrew, interrupted Diggory. I don't believe he knows anything about it. He's never had the pluck to come here himself. He's only talked of one other world, but suppose there were dozens. You mean this wood might be only one of them? No, I don't believe this wood is a world at all. I think it may be sort of an in-between place. Polly looked puzzled. Don't you see? Said Diggory. No, do listen. Think of our tunnel under the slates at home. It isn't a room in any of the other houses, by the way. It's really just isn't really part of any of the other houses. But once you're in the tunnel, you can go along and come to any of the houses in the row. Mightn't this wood be the same? A place that isn't any of the worlds, but once you've found that place, you can get into them all? Well, even if you can, began Polly, but Diggory went on as if he hadn't heard her. And of course, that explains everything, he said. That's why it is so quiet and sleepy here. Nothing ever happens here. Like at home. It's on the houses that people talk and do things and have their meals. Nothing goes on in the in-between places behind the walls and above the ceilings and under the floor and on our own tunnel. But when you come out of the tunnel, you find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into jolly well anywhere. We don't need to jump back into the same pool we came up by, or not just yet. The wood between the worlds, said Polly dreamily. It sounds rather nice. Come on, said Diggory. Which pool shall we try? Look here, said Polly. I'm not going to try any new pool until we've made sure we can get back to the old one. We're not even sure if that'll work yet. Yes, said Diggory, and got caught by Uncle Andrew and have our rings taken away before we've had any fun. No thanks. Couldn't we just go part of the way down into our own pool, said Polly, just to see if it works? And then if it does, we change rings and come back up, and we're really back before we're really back into Mr. Kettley's study. Can we go part of the way down? Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it'll take time going back. Diggory made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring in the new worlds until she made sure about getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he about some dangers, wasps, for instance, but she also was not so interested in finding out things as nobody had ever heard of before, for Diggory was the sort of person who wants to know everything, and when he grew up, he became the famous Professor Kirk who comes in the other books. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their rings. Green for safety, he said Diggory, so you can't help remember which is which. And hold hands and jump. But as soon as they seemed to be getting back to Uncle Andrew's study or even their own world, Polly said was to shout, change, and they would slip off their greens and put on their yellows. Diggory wanted to be the one to shout change, but Polly wouldn't agree. They put on their green rings, took hands, and once more shouted, 1, 2, 3, go. This time it worked. It's very hard to tell you what it felt like, for everything happened so quickly. At first there were bright yellow lights moving about the black sky. Diggory always thinks these were stars and swears that he saw Jupiter quite close enough to see its moon. But almost at once there were rows and rows of roofs and chimneys and posts about them, and they could see St. Paul's, and they knew they were looking at London. But you could see through the walls of all the houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew, very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking all the time, just as if he were coming into focus. But before he became quite real, Polly shouted, change! And they did change. And our world faded away like a dream. And the green light above grew stronger and stronger until their heads came out of the pool and they scrambled ashore. And there was wood all about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. There, said Diggory, that's all right. Now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one. Stop, said Polly. Aren't we going to mark this pool? They stared at each other and turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Diggory had just been going to do, for there were any number of pools in this wood, and the pools were all alike, and the trees were all alike, so that if they had once left behind the pool that led to their own world without making some sort of landmark, the chances would have been 100 to 1 against their ever finding it again. Diggory's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife and cut a long strip of turf on the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was of rich reddish brown, and it showed well against the green. It's a good thing one of us has some sense, said Polly. Well, don't keep on gassing about it, said Diggory. Come along, I want to see what's in one of the other pools. and Polly gave him a very sharp answer, and he said something even nastier in reply. The quarrel lasted for several minutes, but it would be dull to write it all down. Let's skip to the moment when they stood at with beating hearts and rather scared faces on the edge of an unknown pool with their yellow rings on, and their hands once more. 1, 2, 3, go! Splash! Once again it hadn't worked. This pool, too, appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they got their feet wet and splashed their legs the second time. That morning, if it was a morning, it seemed to be always the same time in the wood between the worlds. Blast and botheration, exclaimed Diggory. What's gone wrong now? We've put our yellow rings on all right. He said yellow for outward journey. Now, the truth was, Uncle Andrew, who knew nothing about the wood between the worlds, had quite the wrong idea about the rings. The yellow ones weren't for outward rings. The green ones weren't for homeward. The rings, at least not in the way he thought, the stuff of which both were made had all come from the wood. The stuff of the yellow rings and the power of drawing you into the wood, it was the stuff that wanted to get back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green rings is the stuff that's trying to get you to its own place, so the green ring would take you out of the wood and into the world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he did not really understand. Most magicians are. Of course, Diggory did not realize the truth quite clearly either. Not until later. But when they had talked it over, they decided to try the green rings on the new pool just to see what happened. I'm game if you are, said Polly, but she really said this because in her heart of hearts, she now felt that neither kind of ring was going to work at all with the new pool, and so there was nothing worse to be afraid of than another splash. I'm not quite sure that Diggory had not the same feeling. At any rate, when they had both put on their green and come back to the edge of the water and taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and less solemn than they had been the first time. 1, 2, 3, go, said Diggory, and they